The difference on Israel and the Palestinians.
I'll recommit America to the goal of a democratic, prosperous Palestinian state living side by side in peace and security with the Jewish state of Israel.
No, I guess that's the same again, but it is quite different from what Mr. Romney himself said behind closed doors back at that infamous fundraiser in Boca Raton just a few weeks ago.
And I look at the Palestinians not wanting to see peace anyway, for political purposes, committed to this destruction and elimination of Israel, and these growing issues, and I say there's just no way. And so what you do is you say you move things along the best way you can, you hope for some degree of stability, but you recognize this is going to remain an unsolved problem.
Look, it's all right. You can't blame Mr. Romney for mimicking the president's foreign policy now. After all, when he tried it on his own, he even managed to bungle the British Olympics, as a new Obama ad keenly reminds us.
There are a few things that were disconcerting.
If he's here to make friends, he's got a funny way of showing it.
It really gives you pause.
Anything the Romney camp has done as it relates to foreign affairs is beyond a stumble. It is an embarrassment.
Domestic policy, you talk about stuff you don't know anything about. You know, you make an ass of yourself. You talk in foreign policy, you start a war.
A familiar face with very wise words. Let's get right to our panel now. In Washington, Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist for The Washington Post and MSNBC political analyst Eugene Robinson, and Michael O'Hanlon, senior fellow with the 21st Century Defense Initiative and director of foreign policy at the Brookings Institution. Two men better equipped. For today, I could not find. Eugene, I have to start with you. You've been a foreign correspondent in places as far afield as Argentina and in Europe. You know the Middle East. Mitt Romney says today that he wants to arm the Syrian rebels with serious amounts of military hardware. I ask you, Eugene, is America ready and willing to start a proxy war with Iran on the road to Damascus?
Well, good question. And first of all, I think you have to ask, given the way Romney has changed his policy in various areas, you have to ask, is he serious about that? But if he is, that's the one sort of soupçon of news, I think, that came out of his speech today. Now, it's not as if we're not already at least assisting in the arming of the rebels. There was an intelligence finding by President Obama earlier this year that essentially said we could give covert aid essentially through our allies, through the Saudis and the Qataris, but we have discouraged them from providing, reportedly, from providing heavy weapons because we're afraid those heavy weapons might fall into the hands of terrorists. So that's the one difference that I think I heard. I'm not sure the American people are ready for that, but at least it's somewhat different from what President Obama wants to do.
But Eugene, I ask you the question again. Is America ready for a proxy war with Iran on Syrian soil? Because that seems to me to be the only thing you can deduce from Mr. Romney's 10th foreign policy speech today.
Well, that's the logical implication, and I think not. I think the American people are not ready for such a war. They'd like things to get better in Syria. They'd like the atrocities to stop, and they prefer that the outcome be favorable to U.S. interests. But I don't think there's any desire to get into a proxy war.
Indeed. Michael, the president urges Assad to step down. He supports Arab efforts in their opposition to the Syrian government. Given the instability of Libya and Egypt, isn't the president's cautious approach to Syria the right one, unless, and I repeat, unless we want to get involved in another war?
Hi, Martin. Well, to be honest with you, I think there's a fairly narrow range of disagreement between the two men here because, as you know, if we think about this kind of a war and we think of all of our range of possible interventions, providing or asking our allies to provide a few more weapons is a relatively modest step along the spectrum. We're not talking about American planes creating a no-fly zone in the Romney speech. We're not talking about creation of any kind of a humanitarian protected ground zone up in the north.
But Michael, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Mike, but we wouldn't expect any details from this man because he never gives us any. The overarching theme of that speech was he wants a new approach in the Middle East, not the approach that we see being expedited by the current president, but a new approach. Now, I accept that he hasn't gone into details, but he doesn't give us details about domestic policy either. Do you not accept that that's what he's saying? That he's actually pushing this country, were he to be in a position of authority, towards some kind of military conflict there?
To be honest with you, I'm more worried about Iran policy than Syria policy, because on Syria policy, I'm sorry, I don't hear the distinction as being as great as you do, although you're right to point out that the candidates haven't been so specific that we can be sure, and you and I can still have this debate because the candidates have not resolved their own stances very clearly. On Iran policy, as your package pointed out, they both say that an Iranian nuclear weapon is unacceptable. But I tend to think that Romney would perhaps give Israel the green light to bomb sooner than Obama might. This is a question of nuance. I happen to wind up on the dovish side of this issue, or at least the relatively dovish side, and prefer Obama's apparently greater restraint and patience. But I think that's the issue where I see potentially a greater disagreement, even though their beginning statement is the same. But then Romney has said he'd be less concerned about a possible Israeli strike. I'm quite concerned about that. I think the president is too.
Indeed. Eugene, Mitt Romney in his speech today suggested that the turmoil in the Middle East was because, and I'm quoting him, the president has not led. But when Romney's advisors are pressed for answers, they tell the New York Times to come back on November the 7th after the election. Is that leadership?
Well, no. I mean, look, let's be honest. The whole thrust of this speech was to make it sound as if Mitt Romney's foreign policy would be bolder and more leader-like than President Obama's, without committing him to specific policy differences, because he doesn't seem to believe in specifically different policies, and so he kind of wants to sound tougher. But it is unclear to me that his policies would depart from the Obama administration's policies at all. He would give us the impression, for example, that he would be more lenient or more tolerant of an Israeli strike on Iran. I personally am not convinced of that. I'm not convinced that his policy wouldn't be essentially the same as President Obama's, which is caution.
Indeed. Eugene Robinson, Michael O'Hanlon, thank you both this afternoon.